Hi, my name is Jaclyn Quiles-Nohar, and I'm a Senior Program Associate with Vera's Reshaping Prosecution program. Prior to working for the Vera Institute of Justice, I was a prosecutor in the Brooklyn District Attorney's Office for 4 years, where I handled misdemeanor and felony cases of domestic violence. And I also worked on policy initiatives throughout the office. Over the past few months, once COVID hit, counties and cities across the country, my work focused on supporting prosecutors in carrying out decarceration policies while also functioning in a virtual court system. In this effort, I talked to district attorneys and their staff in counties all over the United States and found that virtual court appearances were occurring in four main areas: in arraignments or bond hearings, grand jury proceedings, case conferences, and a little less common in jury selection and trial. Some of the biggest challenges that occurred during this time was that oftentimes defendants would not be present. This was particularly concerning for arraignments and bond hearings because that means that the prosecutor, the defense attorney, and the judge are making decisions about the defendant's ability to be released without the defendant being present, meaning that if the defendant had any sort of medical issues or any sort of other vital information that they need to tell their defense attorney, that's not being conveyed or considered during that time. So there were many individuals during this time who were not present during their arraignments, but were suffering from medical conditions that made them vulnerable to COVID-19, and the judges were deciding to keep them in jail. I think what became the issue was the logistics for making sure that the people who were in custody were able to access the virtual court hearing. Another major issue was that courts often use paper-based systems. This means that the court files themselves are paper. It could also mean that the prosecutor's files are paper, and possibly even, police paperwork was all provided to the prosecutor physically. This made it really difficult for any sort of meaningful proceedings to happen on the record because it would require that somebody deliver the physical files to the judge in order for the virtual proceeding to take place. This was particularly an issue in Chicago, where defense attorneys were not consenting to hearings happening without the judge having the physical file present. If the file is not physically in front of the judge in that jurisdiction, then nobody can trust, according to the defense attorneys, they could not trust that any actions that were taken on the case, such as releasing their client, would actually be recorded and carried out. So therefore, in order for virtual hearings to work, courts need to allow for e-filing, meaning that important documents that need to be filed with the court need to be submitted via computer, meaning that prosecutors or defense attorneys can scan documents into the computer and then file and upload them to a court website for the judge to then have available to them on their computer. The same thing goes for prosecutors. Oftentimes prosecutors also have paper-based systems, meaning that any evidence that they have is going to be physical and it's not going to be contained on a computer. In jurisdictions like New York City, we found that virtual court proceedings were a little bit easier because the prosecutors had access to all the police paperwork, all the documentation, other evidence, because the police would upload all of their evidence onto a virtual cloud that the prosecutors had access to. Further, in virtual court proceedings or in any court system, it is incredibly important to preserve the record. Preserving the record is a vital piece to ensure that the defendant's rights are not being sacrificed or trampled on during a case. That's why it's incredibly important that everything from the prosecutor's paperwork to the file for the judge is all provided virtually. Another main challenge to virtual court proceedings is that in many jurisdictions, grand jury proceedings and even trials are beginning to happen virtually. This is a particular issue for defendants because it is critically important that the defense attorney, the prosecutor, and even the juries could evaluate the credibility of witnesses in person. There's something lost in Zoom. You don't really get to feel an individual's personal energy or really get to evaluate somebody's, nonverbal type of communication that is really critical to assessing a person's credibility. Since grand jury proceedings are usually are required for prosecutors to go through in order to press felony charges against a defendant, this is particularly concerning because this means that if grand jury proceedings are virtual, it's going to be even more favorable and more likely that defendants would be indicted. Lastly, virtual court proceedings could be really helpful in the discovery and plea negotiations. As I mentioned earlier, if a prosecutor has all of their discovery, including audio evidence, video evidence, surveillance footage, police paperwork, any written confessions, if all that information is stored on a cloud, then it could be much easier and is much easier to be able to send that to the defense attorney on time so that the defense attorney has enough time to evaluate the case and inform their client on whether or not they should accept a plea or the risks associated with accepting a certain plea offer from the prosecutor. Oftentimes, having the full discovery is one of the biggest issues in helping defense attorneys be able to adequately advise their clients over whether or not they should take a plea offer. Virtual court proceedings have the potential to really help that process, but prosecutors have to have the technology and the time to really make sure that they're providing everything to the defense attorneys. So, virtual court proceedings can definitely help speed up the process and help facilitate prosecutors to share evidence more quickly. For example, without virtual court proceedings, or even if prosecutors' evidence is not available on a cloud, what I used to do as a prosecutor is having to make a physical copy on a CD of video surveillance and then physically provide that to the defense attorney. That actually takes a long time, so having a cloud or an online system really helps speed up that process. So virtual court proceedings could definitely help get cases resolved more quickly and can help defendants get the discovery that they're entitled to. But we have to keep in mind that this technology should only be used to better serve defendants. As I mentioned, we need to caution against the use of virtual court proceedings for grand juries or for jury trials or other hearings. This is a really concerning trend because the job of prosecutor is to provide fairness and justice, and that includes respecting and honoring the rights of defendants.